looking forward to this second session on a very interesting topic indeed. Let me just welcome our chair of this session, who is Tim Suter. Tim is another broadcasting veteran. He spent 15 years across television, radio and online at the BBC. But he's experienced on both sides of the platform because also he's been at Ofcom, where he's head of the content board, and he was also head of broadcasting policy at DCMS, responsible for the passage of the 2003 Communications Act, which I think makes him particularly well placed to lead a discussion as to what might happen in the upcoming, we expect, upcoming media bill. We have a great panel as well. I will leave it to Tim to introduce the panel, except to say a special welcome to Professor Steven Barnett, who sadly smashed a hip a little while ago, but despite that has made it in today to join the panel. So thanks, Steve, and over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Colin. Yes, I have to say, when I agreed to chair this session, my mind wandered back the best part of 20 years to the 2003 Communications Act as it became, and a bit more of that in a moment. But nevertheless, I think we couldn't have had a better panel to help us pick our way through what we might want and what we might not want from the promised bit of legislation. We've got Damian, very experienced, a very distinguished chair of the DCMS committee, also a government position in this area, so who better to guide us through what the politics of this might be. Helen has already been introduced to you, need no further introduction, one of the most distinguished editorial leaders that the BBC has had and was a good colleague of mine all those many years ago. Gareth, who also sees this from a number of different perspectives. He's been at the BBC, he's been at Ofcom, he's now at ITV, so he can pick his way through from those different perspectives. And Steve, notwithstanding being there on crutches, his mind, no doubt, ever more agile and nimble. Steve has followed this particular debate all the way through its many twists and turns and will no doubt give us his reflections. I was thinking back those nearly 20 years ago. I recall when I took on the job as head of broadcasting policy, coming pretty fresh from the BBC, the man who offered me the job, I said to him, but I come from the BBC, I don't know anything about putting through legislation. You're just about to publish a draft bill. I don't know how it works. He said, oh, don't worry, dear boy, you know, it'll all be done by, there's a bill team, they'll see it all. You won't have to worry yourself about that. Absolute nonsense. I recall in those days, we had sort of handles for the big flashing issues that needed to be sorted out. One of them was 2014. What was 2014? That was the moment that the ITV licenses were going to expire and we would have to come up with a new licensing regime. There was the ownership stuff about changing and modifying the ownership rules to relax those. Section 301, again, was something I had to teach myself about, and that was to do with the competition powers that Ofcom would have and whether it could apply them before there was a competition problem. And some people were getting very exercised about that. And then there was the whole issue of must carry, must offer, must provide, must distribute, all the musts. I have to say, reliving all of that was a bit of a nightmare for me. So it'll be very interesting to hear from the panel what they think will be the main concerns this time round. I also reflected that it's going to be very important to hear your voice in this, because I had two slightly off-the-record reflections. The first was that when we went to the liaison committee with the draft bill, it was the moment when the then Director General of the BBC said that he didn't consider it his job to make independent producers rich, that we went back and started to write the provisions for what became the terms of trade, because it was obvious that that was going to be needed. We had a structure of regulation that had some things in what was called at that time Tier 2, which was where you would have kind of harder-edged quantitative provisions to protect certain kinds of output, and we were we certainly expected that children's provision, which was not included in that list, might come up, but it didn't. So I think it's interesting where and how actually the voices of influence can come through and change legislation. So we have a white paper from the government. It's talking about ensuring a contribution to protect culture, to promote the economy, and to contribute to our democracy. Those are, if you like, the key themes. And I suppose I'd like to start really by just inviting my panel to reflect on what they'd like to see in a future Media Act and what they hope is not included in it. So why don't I start at the far end with Steve, as a veteran of many acts and many government instruments. What do you want to see in it, and what do you not want to see in it?
I always hate the word veteran.
Especially now.
I was just telling Damian and Sophie outside that when the surgeon came round and told me that the hip was broken, he said, "But you're young and fit, so we don't have to replace it." And I thought, that's the first time I've been called that in a very long time. Okay, what I want to see, can I just take you back to 22nd of March 2018? The then Culture Secretary made a solemn commitment to Parliament. I just want to read his words. He said, "We've required Ofcom to report before December 2020 on how we can ensure that prominence can work effectively in the digital age. I made it clear during the debates on the digital economy bill that if Ofcom's report makes it clear there's a problem and one that can only be fixed by legislation, we will introduce that legislation." Okay, we will introduce that legislation. Now, that was 6 culture secretaries ago.
About 2 years.
You'll be forgiven. Yeah, exactly. Now, you'll be forgiven for not remembering their name, because we've been through so many. I'll just give you a clue. They're rather more famous at the moment for eating kangaroo peanuts in the jungle, which might be an appropriate reflection on the current state of British politics. And it might also explain why in the intervening 4.5 years, despite a very clear recommendation from Ofcom, absolutely nothing has happened. So I think the very first thing that has to be in there, and I'm sure colleagues on the panel will be saying much the same thing, Alex Mahon said 2 or 3 months after that statement from Hancock, she said in a speech, the single biggest thing we need to do to safeguard British public service broadcasting television for the future is prominence, and she was right, because we've legislated over the years to ensure that in the linear world, the advantages of PSB, the investment in creative programming, British content for British citizens, all the things that make PSB important for our culture, our economy, our democracy, will be accessible, will be discoverable, and audiences want it. I mean, all the research from Ofcom, we're not talking about material. This is not a kind of Reithian paternalistic approach saying this is what people ought to see. That went years ago. This is about saying this is what audiences want. This is what we believe is right. This is what Parliament has legislated is right. But as more and more people move towards streaming services, sticks, smart TVs, etc., they can't find that content. So the crucial thing in this media bill has got to be legislating for prominence. But the other thing is speed. 4.5, it's absolutely mad that we've had this commitment 4.5 years ago and nothing has happened. So I think that is the number one priority. Number 2 is speed. I was going to say something about the government's announcement for a consultation on the new listed events regime for the digital world. I think that's also important. It's long overdue. It needs to be in the bill. I think we've also got to talk about audio prominence, the fact that if you go to Alexa or Google Home or whatever, you've got no idea, and you ask for the news headlines, you've got no idea whose news you're going to get. I think there are issues there for democracy, so we need to cover audio prominence. The only other thing I would love to see in there, and this is a very forlorn hope, but we've had at least 3 in my recollection, 3 Lord Select Committee recommendations in separate inquiries. I think Tim was advising on one, I was advising on another one, that there should be an independent framework for setting the BBC licence fee, or whatever the new committee decides is going to be the BBC public funding. But the idea of these secret negotiations with guns held to Director General's heads, which clearly involves political pressure and compromise, is a bad look for us. It's a bad statement to the rest of the world about BBC independence. So it's not going to happen this time. But at some point, we must have an independent framework for setting BBC funding and actually for appointing BBC chairs. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Steve. Gareth, what are you looking for in this? What's on your shopping list? Prominence, I imagine, will be on your shopping list as well.
Yes, I thought maybe I wasn't going to have to speak for a minute. It's front and centre for us too. Look, it's great to be back, and it's nice to be here in person. It's the first thing to say. It's been a long time, and I hope you take it with the spirit intended. That I hope this is the last time I'm invited to speak to you all about the need for a media bill. We did this last time round, and it's still important and it's still urgent. So let's hope that this is taken forward quickly. You've heard a lot today about why PSB matters. I think it matters more than ever. And that is to all of us as viewers, as listeners, as citizens, but also to underpinning the creative economies that are so important to many of us in the UK and are fundamental engines for growth in a world where looking for growth areas seems to be the right thing to be looking for. So that I'm going to start with a note of optimism, if I may, because it's easy to hear the doom and gloom, but there is reasons for optimism. ITV is in great creative shape at the moment. It's an exciting place to be. We've got the 2 top performing soaps in the UK. We've got 6 of the top 10 most performing dramas in the UK, 7 of the top 10 entertainment shows in the UK, and of course the World Cup has kicked off with something of a bang this week. So I think on creative form, it's an exciting time to be at ITV. We've also got our new streaming service, ITVX, launching imminently, an early Christmas present for all of you, I hope. And that has got a genuinely exciting and expanded range of new UK content that I think is going to offer something for everybody. It surprised me when I saw the show reel, but I'm most looking forward next year to Nolly, which is a Russell T Davies biopic of Noel Gordon, the Crossroads star, played by Helen Carter. It looks absolutely brilliant, so look out for that one coming next year. And ITV Studios, our commercial arm, is expanding incredibly rapidly. It's cementing its position as one of the biggest global producers of content, both in the UK, but also a great British brand performing abroad, which I think is great. But unsurprisingly, I'm going to tell you that there are reasons to be concerned about the future of PSB. Our PSB contribution is I think, incredibly important. It's the regional news services that I hope many of you know well and love. It's support for indies. It's our huge presence outside of London. We heard about the BBC earlier. About half of our staff are based outside of London, operating out of around 44 different centres. That's a really important base for us to hear what audiences think across the UK, but also to just bring that UK presence to all of our output. All of those things are underpinned by regulatory assets that are very much rooted in the old world. It is about DTT spectrum, and it is about linear broadcast EPG prominence. And the value of those assets is declining rapidly as people watch less live television, and the live TV they do watch is not always delivered over DTT, over Freeview. So we need a media bill to change the nature of the PSB Compact to ensure that it is fit for a fully digital and hybrid age. The other thing which has come up and is related to prominence is that the way in which audiences are finding content is changing rapidly. And increasingly, the way in which people are finding programmes to watch or finding services are through a handful of platforms that are controlled by global online giants. They determine whether our services are available to UK audiences. That's their choice. They decide whether or not it is easy to find those services, and they try to dictate the terms on which those services are carried. And that is a fundamental challenge to the future of UK broadcasting, to the UK media industry. That is why we were pleased with the government white paper. We're pleased to see the recognition of that challenge and the reforms not only to prominence, which Stephen covered, but also the linked provisions, and crucially linked provisions, of inclusion. It's no good having rules that say you are easy to find if they can simply refuse to carry you. And fair value, where again, it is no good being forced onto platforms and easy to find if the price of that is what the platform believes to be the global value of your presence on those platforms. So in the round, the absolutely central part of the media bill that will have a transformative effect for the UK media industry are the reforms around prominence, inclusion and fair value. And that's why it is a matter of urgency that this bill needs to be brought forward and these reforms put in place.
And what do you see replacing, as you say, the declining regulatory assets that you get at the moment in a linear world? What's the nature of the new compact that you're looking for? Where will that value come from for you?
Yeah, look, so the first area the value has to come, if you like, is from our own output. So you are seeing a huge investment from ITV, both in the underlying technology of ITVX, a new streaming service, which I hope when you see it, you will recognise is up there with all of the big, shiny global streaming platforms you're already used to. And it's about the content. It's making brilliant British content that people love. What we're calling for and the way in which this can be preserved for future is a regulatory regime for PSB that ensures that, for instance, the standard terms of a digital platform, that you must forego 35% of your advertising revenue as the price of being on those platforms, is simply not sustainable. And so the reforms the government is suggesting that will apply not only to our live services, but also to our streaming services, means that however PSB is delivered in future, and whether that is broadcast, whether it's live, whether it's on demand, the rules around how easy you are to find, allowing you to generate viewing and to be on terms that allow personalised service, access to data, retention of advertising revenues, are the things for us that will allow us to sustain a PSB contribution in the future.
Helen, what do you want to see in it?
So I was a late addition to this panel, and so I'm the least expert person on it. But what I'd most like from this media bill is clarity. I mean, I really struggle to find an internally coherent story about public service media, its importance or its future. There's a kind of grudging acceptance that it currently exists, a desire for it to be more commercial, and whatever that means in this context, and a kind of, to me, lack of focus in terms of the imperatives that you talked about. Concerns for me, some specious arguments. The paper says, choice in programming is no longer a problem. Really? That's largely true in some genres, entertainment and drama in particular, although I do think the success of Strictly shows how passionately people love culturally specific entertainment, not globalised Netflix. It's definitely not true in categories like documentaries, religion, science, arts and culture, and of course genuinely local, regional programming. And those are all genres where public service media currently fill a gap in commercial provision. And the paper doesn't seem to appreciate that funding shapes content. You know, I don't need to tell this audience that it's not an accident that for the BBC, the guarantee of its public service content has always been the embattled licence fee, the least worst option. It was invented precisely to ensure the BBC was free from commercial imperatives to serve all audience and deliver both mainstream popular content and accessible market failure content. And no one ever said that was easy, and there will be a debate on this today at this conference. But I think the bill reflects a limited and surprisingly muddled understanding of the challenges. It says the government will support the BBC to become more commercially successful and less reliant on the licence fee. It's like the form of the BBC's funding is an uncomfortable problem to be wished away by the magical wand of commercialisation. We know that the form of the BBC's funding, even if it's to modernise and change, is fundamental to its success as its point and purpose, which is not to say that the BBC hasn't been incredibly inventive and canny. particularly through partnerships in this country, about commercialisation. And as I said in the last session, I do worry that this provision in the bill is actually mesmerising the BBC board to the detriment of independent commissioning and independent thought about what the BBC's point is all about. As a radio person, I'm slightly crushed that there's only 3 little clauses about radio in the bill, all suggesting more deregulation for commercial radio. I started in commercial radio. I'm not snooty about it. I love it. But my small personal thing would be to demand in the bill that commercial radio does a lot more for the audio independent sector. At the moment, it's only the poor old BBC that has to commission independent radio production, and that doesn't seem fair to me. And obviously, I'd like those a framework that put public service in there. And just like everyone else has said, prominence is actually the key thing. If you don't know where to find it, or in audio terms, if you can't know where it's come from, it becomes irrelevant because you make it irrelevant. And to Peter's point about the political hostility towards the BBC, I have to say, I think for all PSBs, there's a kind of underlying sense that, oh, we really wish they weren't here, and we're certainly not going to help them along the way. But I know Damian, a good Tory, is going to counter that.
So, Damian, are you going to counter that? What do you think will be in it?
Well, I think I agree with the what was said about prominence. That's the most important thing, I think, for the PSB sector, and it's not just prominence on the programming guides. I mean, in some ways, this debate's been going on so long that it started off as a debate about the electronic programming guide, which itself has now almost become totally redundant as a consequence of new smart televisions that people use. But ensuring that there is prominence for the public broadcasters, that they're not pushed off, and there are not huge commercial penalties put in place for the sort of prominence they might want. That's going to apply not just on a screen, but also, as was touched on earlier, through smart devices in people's homes. So, if you want Alexa to give you a decent ranking when you ask for news content from a provider, does that come with a huge price attached? Other services competing for that space. How easy are you to find? And also through distribution on online platforms as well. I think this may also touch on some of the things that will be covered in the digital markets legislation as well, about fair access to platforms, without commercial penalties. I was talking to a publisher, who said that you have a periodic renegotiation of your terms of trade with Amazon, which can start off with Amazon saying, we're not going to sell your books anymore, and now we've got 3 months to determine what the new rate will be. Even relatively large companies find themselves in that position. Do AI-driven recommendation tools on social media platforms, are they biased towards some form of media over others? If these are the routes where people are getting their information, and actually in a world where we often talk about the central role sort of video sharing platforms play in people's daily viewing habits now, particularly for younger audiences, but for all audience, the reach numbers for YouTube are in the 90s in terms of regular access. Well, the experience on those platforms is not people searching for things they're interested in. It's things being selected through data profiling and played to them. How does public broadcasting content exist in that environment? So these are the challenges. I think the bill will help with that. I think both the markets bill and the media bill, in ensuring at least there is a right to be in the market, a right to certain prominence within that market. If we fail to achieve that, the problem then, I think, becomes one for the broadcasters in a way, because BBC and Channel 4 are publicly owned, so they're kind of stuck. They're stuck with what they've got. ITV is not. Even though they would always be furious deniers of ITV, they'd even countenance such an idea. But the slight danger is that a television company like ITV says, well, you know what? We'll just make the programs we want to make, and we'll make money out of those, and you can forget everything else because we just can't it doesn't make any sense anymore, and the prominence that comes with all these public obligations isn't worth very much, and so we'll just go off and do our own thing. And there is a real danger that companies may have to make those decisions. So getting the prominence piece right is really important. I think just a comment on the broadcasters in turn. I think the challenge for the BBC and the license fee is the biggest danger I think the BBC faces with the license fee is a declining number of people paying it. You know, I mean, imagine, I thought one good indication of the BBC's internal concern about this was I thought an advert I heard on the radio, which I thought was a bit desperate, which was encouraging parents to buy a TV license for their children when they went to university. Because if you were a student and you largely watch television through a laptop, you know, the idea is, if I take this laptop from one house to another, I need to buy a separate license fee for each property I take it to watch the BBC. I mean, it makes no sense at all, let alone the choice of other services that exist for news and information. But of course, the importance of the BBC is consistency. It is always there, and it's always there when we need it. You know, and the nation rallies around it, as we saw with the impeccable broadcasting of the funeral of the Queen. I mean, we heard, you know, I remember hearing Nick Robinson talking during the Ukrainian war about saying, he slightly went off on one saying on the Today programme saying, you know, people talk about Netflix and Apple, but they can't do this. They don't have reporters all around the world. And that's right. But that's not the choice consumers are facing. They want the BBC for news, and they want it to always be there when they need it. But they're also attracted to other content produced by other people. So how much are they going to pay for? And I think the question for the BBC is really, what do we want the BBC to do? And how much is it going to cost to do that? And then where does the money come from to provide that in a sustainable way? Because there is a huge underlying value. Now, of course, that could be, as many Director Generals have said in the past, that the BBC does fewer things better. It could be that, you know, rather than spreading the money as thinly as possible, that you concentrate on smaller things. It could be that bolt-on subscriber services on top of that provide extra revenue to do more things. But I think at the heart of it, we've got to decide what actually is the BBC for, you know, and how much money is required to deliver that. I would question as well, looking at some of the recent cuts to BBC local radio. So I look for Radio Kent. There will no longer be a locally made drive programme at peak time in the evenings. So it's not like the audiences have disappeared for these services. The audience is very much there for these services. They're very popular, but that's where the cuts are being made. I wonder if you had a poll of licence fee payers, whether if they had to find savings within the BBC, that is where they would choose to make them. And I think the BBC has to, if it wants to hold the trust of audiences, has got to think very carefully about that. And also, I think in terms of holding audiences, does the BBC need to worry about holding 1 million viewers through the day on BBC One and BBC Two? It doesn't, because it's of no commercial relevance to it. They could, I think, be more experimental, more distinct in the content offered, certainly outside of peak hours. But I agree completely with Helen. The success of the programmes like Strictly shows there is a huge market both for culturally relevant content that comes from a country that is popular. It doesn't have to be all highbrow, but it is very popular. And also for live television. And I think there may well be the tension here becomes the tension between live television and on-demand, you know, where the PSBs have, I think, a very clear role in live event-based television, which is on ITV as much the World Cup coverage as it is I'm a Celebrity, as it is Strictly. You know, it's a range of things, but things that happen at a certain time and people gather to see them. I think the bigger challenge is for the public broadcasters is what happens elsewhere in the schedule, you know, where I think audiences are drifting away. I think the great example of that is the Christmas Day. I looked a few years ago, the Christmas Day viewing figures over the last decade, and they're almost half of what they were. You know, but it just shows you when people are doing other things now. I think the prominence question I think is particularly important for ITV. For the BBC, I think it's a question about what do we want it to do and how much does it cost. For Channel 4, I don't think that Channel 4 privatisation maybe has the push behind it did earlier in the year. But there is a perfectly... I thought that question should have been taken seriously because there is a question about how sustainable is a standalone advertising-funded television company. You know? And really the challenge should be how can we make sure Channel 4 is successful so it can reinvest more of its revenues back into making programmes, which is what it was set up to do. And so I think it may well be because we had a bit of a post-COVID boom in the ad market. We've now got Christmas and a World Cup, which is great for the commercial ad market. In the longer run, how easy is it going to be for companies like Channel 4 to migrate audiences onto their digital platforms and then ensure their ad revenue doesn't decline, even if it comes in from other sources? How easy is that going to be? At the moment, I think the best you could say is they've just about been able to do it. But you know, a shock to the system that could come with a big recession may change that. So that is, I think this is not a sort of question of saying, you know, to think this means you dismiss Channel 4 and its values and what it's brought to British creativity and the work it does telling the stories of the nation. It is simply to say, in this new environment, how sustainable is this model going to be? And I think that is something we may well have to confront at some point.
So Channel 4 privatisation, unlikely to make it in there.
I was not when I was at DCMS. I was not the broadcasting minister, so I don't have. I'm not privy to that information or not exactly. But I think there doesn't seem to be the same heat in that debate that there was.
You won't be held to it.
Yeah.
So there's a broad consensus around us that rising to the challenge that 20 years ago was there in must-carry obligations, rising to that challenge now of achieving prominence, of achieving carriage, of achieving fair terms, is crucial because we've recognised that the nature of consumption has changed and that more people are watching online and consuming online, including radio. Can I ask you a bit about what that does to the remit? Helen, you touched on this, that 20 years ago there was a sort of relaxation of the remit that allowed organisations to deliver it taken together, taken as a balance of what they did. I suspect there's a bit of a concern that says the broader you describe the way the remit can be delivered, the more likely it is that the bits of the remit that are not likely to attract very large audiences are going to be shuffled to the edge of an increasingly broad range of services and means of distribution.
I feel very...
Should that be protected against?
Yes, it should, and I think Ofcom should be called to account on what it's been doing in terms of examining remits and, for all PSBs, including the BBC. That it's kind of just seeping away by the cracks and saying it's the equivalent of putting things out at midnight. I mean, that doesn't operate anymore. So I think one of the challenges of this bill, if it's not a grudging acceptance of PSBs, but actually a genuine embracing of what it can bring the country with some challenging questions, because I think you're right, the remits both have to be better defined, more clearly defined, with thought and engagement behind them, because we're living in a modern age. You can't just go back to Rethian things. And then I think Ofcom should be called to account for the way it is both upholding the remits and things like impartiality. I mean, I find it extraordinary that Ofcom has done nothing about GB News and its COVID deniers. I think there's just a whole area where, for good or ill, I can't see their flag being stuck in the ground, and yet they're key to the governance of media. I mean, it's an organisation I've always hugely respected, but they just seem very, very quiet at the moment, Tim, as a former Ofcom person.
Can I add to that, Tim? I just want to, I think, endorse everything that Helen said. One of the things that worried me a bit about this media bill is that there was a sense that it might be a sort of replacing the 03 Comms Act rather than developing it for the digital world. And I think there are two things in that Comms Act that we must preserve, and the most important one is, and you will remember this, the battle to ensure that citizens, furthering the interests of citizens, was in there from the very beginning. And I do worry that Ofcom is forgetting about that. In terms of its relationship to PSB, to impartiality, the duties, the statutory duties placed upon it. I got into trouble. There was a conference last year where I talked about Ofcom breathing the political atmosphere, which was, I think, probably rather more antagonistic then than it is now. And who's the guy who's head of content at Ofcom? Kevin came back very quickly and said, "We the only air we breathe is that of independence." He didn't like my comment at all. And yeah, of course, Ofcom aspires to be independent, but I'm afraid that I think actually planting that flag, I think that's a great analogy. I don't see that flag being planted. I think it needs, to be a bit crude about it, to grow a pair and to do a little bit more. The other thing about that Comms Act, by the way, was that it was the duty on Ofcom to promote public service broadcasting in terms of the 5-year reviews. And there are times when I sort of worry that particularly its most recent consultation, which talked about PSM, public service media, where you then start to get into market gap arguments because you're talking about types of content rather than institutions. And I think that's a dangerous road to go down.
I do think it's tempting to roll out it was much better when I was there anecdote. But actually, look, I think, defence of my former colleagues, look, I think one of the things that I find most frustrating about the debate about PSB is everybody has something, many somethings that they care deeply about. it is very easy for people to say the BBC should do fewer things better. But it's interesting when it tries to stop doing anything, there is immediately uproar. It's very easy to say that there are a whole host of content types that we'd all like to see protected, and I think nobody disagrees with it. People go very quiet on how you pay for the content in a world where we've moved from a broadcast world of near monopoly of advertising to a world where the likes of Google and Amazon and Facebook are taking magnitudes more revenue, where the content market is becoming increasingly global, and we as PSBs are competing in a market with those people, and we have to do that. We have to make programs that people want to watch. We have to try and do that with the talent that's available. So there's a great competition for that. There's huge content inflation. And it's the bit of the conversation when we talk about remits, about quotas, about the role of PSB, where people don't have an idea of how to deal with the fact we don't have this monopoly in ad revenue anymore. How do you fund the investment in things that it is very notable are not made by purely commercial players? That's not a criticism. It's the business model. It's the way a global content market
Surely
works.
that's the conversation that needs to start. It's a sophisticated conversation about a changing revenue market, which is still not about abandoning remits altogether.
Oh, exactly.
I mean, unless you have that conversation now around this bill, I'm not sure where it's going to happen.
Absolutely, and I think it was, sorry, one quick one, it was notable when the debate raised last time about children's content, how quickly it became about broadcast linear quotas on services that are amongst the least watched.
And that's not the conversation.
It's not the conversation we should be. And I think that's the conversation Ofcom has tried to promote, but I can understand the concerns people have about the loosening of the remit, if you like.
And I'm sure it's a conversation we're going to pick up from the floor in a moment. I just want to ask one last, as it were, thematic question about this potential new bill, which is around democratic support for news, trusted news, attempts to combat misinformation and disinformation. What do you think we should be looking? Is this the instrument we should be looking for to deal with this? And if so, how? Damian.
Well, I don't think it's just the media bill, I mean, for that. So, I mean, the online safety bill deals with some aspects of disinformation. So state-sponsored disinformation is a regulatory, identifying and then mitigating the architecture of disinformation will be something Ofcom will take on responsibility for, where it can be found, where disinformation is clearly being used to endanger public health. Then Ofcom will have powers through the online safety bill there, to protect people from harm and self-harm. But it is you then really come into when you come into the broadcasting environment, you're then looking at the general broadcasting obligations around accuracy, fairness, balance. Some broadcasters take that in the round. I mean, LBC do that by having very different voices, different points in the schedule. There's, you might say with both GB News and Channel 4 News, a perception of a worldview, which is reflected in their outcome, in their output. But to what extent does that comply with the requirements Ofcom should set, for balance as part of the output as well? So I think Ofcom already has powers in that space. There's a question of how they use them. And there's a question as well about the extent to which is now already happening. Major video on demand platforms have some of the obligations of broadcasters have, and Ofcom has a role in policing them too, because we should recognise that a YouTuber with 1 million subscribers to their channel is probably getting a bigger audience than a lot of daytime television programmes are getting. So there is a responsibility that comes with that power as well. And I think in the regulatory environment, what we're going to see in lots of different ways is bringing the online world and the broadcasting world more into line. Certainly for big audience, for large audiences, and there being less distinction between the two for the major platforms and the platforms like YouTube, where you've got user-generated content, but people are creating very big numbers around it. And I think whether that is a safety issue or it's about the responsibilities that come with prominence and audience size, I think that's the sort of shift we will see, and that's already started.
Can I just push back on one thing that Damian said? I think the idea of opposing Channel 4 News with GB News, saying that they are two examples of a different worldview. Channel 4 News will always try to give both sides of an argument. GB News has no interest whatsoever, apart from its tendency to host anti-vaxxers, conspiracy theorists and whatever. It has no interest in putting opposing views. And I mean, a very good example for this audience is debates on the BBC licence fee or BBC funding. They are not interested in having anyone on. They might have a token defender who will then be vehemently attacked, beaten over the head. Whereas somebody from the IEA or the Taxpayers Alliance will have half an hour, a pat on the head, and jolly good chap, great arguments. So I'm afraid they are not two peas in the same pod. They are completely different entities, and that's why it's about time Ofcom, if it takes impartiality seriously, has got to do something about it.
I thought that by saying that comparison would be provocative, and it clearly was. But the reason I say it is, I think politically, if you were in the House of Commons, that is an argument people would make.
I understand that, but it's wrong.
Yeah. But you might think it's wrong. But I'm saying, in terms of the politics of how people see this, these are the trade-offs that they think are being made. And I think that's why there needs to be a debate as part of this around what do we mean, what are the obligations of broadcasters and how they deliver in a fair balance in return for having an Ofcom licence.
I understand that. Sorry, on the online safety bill, my understanding is, Damian, you might know better, that it's going to be gutted, that all the stuff that is supposed to be legal but harmful, of which disinformation is clearly a major part, is going to be thrown out.
It's the change. So changes will be made. There's been discussion around changes being made to legal but harmful, but the bill's not being gutted as a consequence of that. What would happen is you would see regulation based on three areas. There's the child protection area. There is transparency and accountability for platforms delivering their own terms of service. So a lot of the content you might put in that legal but harmful category is already covered in the terms of service of the platforms, but there's no independent analysis of whether they actually deliver it or not. And the third area then is for adults is the priority illegal harms, which are based on a schedule of offences that are on the face of the bill. So that deals with things like race hate and harassment, incitement, and various other serious public order offences. Will include things like the new offence around promoting self-harm, cyber flashing, the new offence around inducing epileptic fits in people by deliberately targeting them with flashing images. So there's quite a lot, and these are all offences in law. So what the bill tries to do is create a framework where you say, if it's illegal offline, it should be regulated online, understood threshold, and Ofcom has powers to make sure that happens, and companies have to fulfil their terms of service if they promise to do things. But the minimum safety standards for all the worst offences are based on our laws, and the obligations are proactive on behalf of the platforms. So they have to actually demonstrate to Ofcom they have systems in place to identify all this content and to mitigate it without being asked to do it. So it does create a very big shift in their responsibilities as a consequence.
So tempting as it may be to sashay into the online safety bill, I'll try and drag us back for our last 10 minutes to give you the opportunity to tell us what you think should be in the bill, what you think shouldn't be in the bill. We've talked about prominence. There seems to be a lot of agreement around the panel. This is a real priority. We've talked about the remit, how you deliver a remit in a world where the way of supporting it is no longer as obvious or straightforward. We've talked about the democratic role of broadcasters as they morph into public service media organisations and what they do to support democracy. But what's on your mind? And I know we've got somebody from the DCMS here who I think may be involved in drawing up the bill. I'm not going to put him on the spot, but I think there's somebody here who may be involved in it, so I'm sure he'll take active interest in what you say. So, as before, hands raised, and if you could introduce yourself. We've got somebody here in the fourth or fifth row back.
Hi, I'm Catherine Johnson from the University of Huddersfield. Thank you for a really interesting panel. My question is whether the panel thinks that prominence legislation as it is currently outlined in the white paper and also in terms of Ofcom's regulations goes far enough. And I'm particularly here thinking about some of the comments that Damian was making, which I really appreciate, that we are public service broadcasters are operating in an environment which is not just about challenges from streaming services. It's not just about smart TVs and so on. It's also a wider platform ecosystem. And if you look at Ofcom's data on changing viewing habits around young people, they're watching YouTube, right? They are watching some SVOD. They are still watching some live television, but they're watching lots and lots of YouTube. So if we introduce prominence legislation that is only focused on smart TVs and maybe on connected devices, we're not addressing that issue. And so I do think, so my question is, how do we address that issue, and should more be done? And I think that the point that Gareth made about prominence legislation not just being about how visible are public service media organisations' content and services, but also what are the terms of trade by which that content is made available. Do we need the media bill to be addressing the terms of trade on YouTube, for example? And if we did that, would that enable the public service broadcasters to be more confident about putting their content out onto YouTube and other social media platforms where younger audiences are, where they're habituated to be, rather than the current strategy, which is to try and drive younger audiences to the likes of iPlayer and BBC Sounds, which, you know, might not work, right? So what do we need to do to address that?
Anybody like to pick that up? That sounded, I mean, I'm certainly going to come back to you to say, what do you think we need to do to address that? But I suspect that was contained within your question, really, which was a plea for policymakers to find a way of doing that. Damian, do you think they will?
Well, I mean, the big challenge within that is you could do as much as you can in legislation in terms of, you know, ensuring prominence for TV, you know, for people that are selling smart TVs and TV devices so that you can easily see where the PSBs are. You could do it through competition legislation to make sure that, say, a platform like YouTube is treating people fairly in terms of the rates that they extract from advertising placed against the content, and that they're not clearly biased towards some content over others. But the question is, do people, even doing all of that, will people want to watch it? And I mean, I was looking in the Media Nations report. I thought one of the things I thought was the most astonishing was less than half the 16 to 24-year-olds are watching at least 15 consecutive minutes of a PSB channel in an average week. You know, it's not just that they're distracted; they are just not there. And therefore you've got a danger of an audience of people. And these trends exist amongst almost every age group, but obviously particularly acute amongst the young. But the danger is a group for younger people, they grow up outside of a PSB environment. The only thing PSBs do for them is they might be distracted by a news story they want to hear about, or a football match they want to watch, or they might like Strictly or I'm a Celebrity, and they will come for those things, but otherwise they've gone. And therefore, to the point about ad revenue for the commercial broadcasters, the question is, you know, that the online display ad market is 90% dominated by Facebook and Google. You know that the idea of the sort of volume audiences that television broadcasters used to rely on to bring money in, you know, it's gone. I think television is probably about to go through a commercial disruption, or probably that is equivalent to what the newspaper industry has gone through, and is now hitting them. Now, there are still ways you can make money in that environment. I think go back to book publishing. It's not a bad example. Actually, you know, rather than scattering, although the price of a book is about the same as what it was 20 years ago, people sell a huge amount more. You know, so the question is, you know, how can PSBs evolve in that market where you're competing against a huge amount of distracting content, or also just people doing other things like playing video games, just not watching television as part of their routine? How can you still make money in that environment to hold audiences? We can do things from a regulatory point of view to make sure people are treated fairly, but you can't make people watch a PSB if they don't want to.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair, and I think the reason I mentioned in my remarks, you first and foremost got to make great stuff that people want to watch, and the government can't help us if we don't make programmes people want to watch. It's fundamentally true. I also think you have to have a degree of realism about what your ambitions are here. So the idea that the correct metric is that we're going to restore viewing among 16 to 24s to the levels it was in the 1980s would be fanciful. So let's not start down that track. But it is absolutely clear that live viewing can and does attract younger viewers at scale. I think we are encouraged by other things we see. So we launched a digital news service called The Rundown on social media. And it's attracting significant volumes of viewing on platforms like Instagram. Now, look, I'm not saying it's the answer to the future of public service broadcasting, but it shows there is an appetite among younger people for what is still pretty heavy-hitting PSB content, but packaged in a way that speaks to them and delivered in a manner that works for them. Now, there's a question about how you scale that, but I think that when you look at the innovations that go into something like ITVX, part of what we're trying to do here is find a way to offer a package of great content and a means of delivery that we think will work for them. We think that the provisions in the media bill then go some way to making sure that they notice it's there. Because the other thing is the world is full of amazing choices. What a time to be a young person with all of the entertainment at your fingertips globally. Amazing. How do you get their attention? Because actually I think we do back our content if they know it's there. Part of the issue is they don't start with the programme guide. They don't start with the Skybox. How do we make sure that when they start their journey about deciding what to watch or what to do, we're in that place? Then it's up to us to compete, but it's about being part of that thought process and part of their mindset.
Any more suggestions or demands that you want to see put on this bill? Yes.
A couple of questions. I'm sure it's really related to the bill, but it might be. There's a view that the BBC should really cover market failures. I mean, I don't go along with that, so the VLV doesn't, but there's that view. But that leaves the question, how do you define what the market failures are? And it's interesting, for instance, S4C, I think, gets about £100 per Welsh speaker. Probably some Welsh people don't speak Welsh watch it. Obviously, it's felt it's spent a lot of money. There are other areas that you have far less. Moving on to that, the talk of regional broadcasting, everyone says, oh, we're moving all these jobs out of London. It strikes me that you're almost moving jobs out of London to pick up quotas. What we haven't got is actually a lot of regional broadcasting. And look back to, if you like, the golden age of ITV. Now, you might say, oh, yes, that was the 60s, that was the 70s. It's very different now. That might be the case. Is there a case for actually having more regional broadcasting actually geared for a regional audience, which probably means a separate funding pot?
Anybody want to support a return to the old ITV regions?
Surely the golden age of ITV is today, no?
Local television, I hear somebody crying.
Indeed. Look, I think it's a genuinely tricky one. I think what is interesting is that people vote with their feet. And I think programmes that have a real connection and resonance to a particular place in the UK are incredibly powerful. And the benefit of a national platform for that, I think, can't be understated. So we look at contrast something like the Pembrokeshire Murders and how much the sense of place comes through in that sort of drama versus an alternative drama maybe filmed in the UK from a service that is trying to make global content. There's space for both of those things, but I think bringing that regional sense to content delivered to everybody is probably the most powerful way of giving people a sense of place without trying to force, certainly from our perspective, commercial structures around limitations to where you can distribute and how you fund yourself. I guess the other part is, what is a regional broadcaster in a world of all information being available to everybody? The idea of constraining your market so tightly, I think, in a world of massive competition, massively inflating production costs, I can't see it, to your point about funding part, it's not commercially sustainable for sure.
I think as well, I think also what ITV was successful at in the past was, before the current structure, was taking stories from the regions to the nation. That's right. Which is, I think, not just regions serving regions, and I think that's a really important part of, telling the story of the country to itself. I remember when I was chairing the select committee, Scottish MPs were complaining, I don't know if this is true, but they were complaining that the BBC hadn't set a major drama in Scotland since Monica the Glen.
That was true until they'd said that, and then it stopped. Funny that.
Time for one last question from Peter.
Who was the first questioner this morning?
The first question of this morning will be the last question of this morning as well, I'm afraid.
Has the media bill been framed in an analysis of what's happened in America? Because what's happened in America is a very, very important example for us. And you know what I'm talking about, the fact that the American broadcasting ecology has shaped and informed the fact that America is becoming ungovernable. One of the reasons that America is becoming ungovernable is because something around 1/3 of the American electorate believes a lie. That's the focus of the ungovernability. In some research done by the University of Zurich, it's lovely to be able to quote something, the University of Zurich, They looked at disinformation and conspiracy theories and resilience towards them across the Western world. And what they determined was an absolutely fundamental factor was the existence of a national broadcaster, not a state broadcaster, which was confident and at scale, which meant the winners were the Nordic nations plus us. And the great loser was America, with its fantastically fragmented, free-for-all world, in which Fox can tell lies on a constant basis. And the big lie was the lie that was sustained by Fox and friends, you know, the little outliers of Fox, that Trump had not lost the election. And we all think our culture is so different, nothing like that could ever happen here to sensible Brits. But we ought to be aware of that in asking what we want from the media bill. So my question is, have the framers of the media bill taken that into account?
Given, Peter, given A, that we're short of time, and B, that none of our panel are actually the framers, I'm going to leave your question hanging in the air for those who are framing the bill to take account of.
Can I make one comment on it, Tim? Because I think Peter's raised an absolutely fundamental issue. It really is fundamental. I'm not sure it's about the media bill, though. I mean, you're absolutely right. All the research, it's not just Zurich. There are other bits of research which show that PSB-type systems protect countries from that kind of polarization and effectively political anarchy. But I think that brings us back to the impartiality regime, actually. And it brings us back to Ofcom and the importance of what happened in America when Reagan abolished the fairness doctrine.
I was just about to say that. The argument in this bill, choice in programming is no longer a problem, is a version of what the fairness doctrine, when it was abolished, said, which was the marketplace of ideas can exist, we no longer need any rules.
And America is a demonstration
I'm going
of
to
what
break my
happens
own
when
rule.
you do that.
One last comment.
So Andrew Scally for the BBC. I was just going to add a little bit of a note of optimism on this score, which is that we did some research last year based on, so the Pew Research had done some research in America looking at trust in national news organizations over the last 10 to 15 years, broken down by left-leaning versus right-leaning audiences. And they noticed that in America, a huge gap has emerged as people have polarized towards media on the left and media on the right in terms of trust, and it's massively broken down. So I asked the same question here, and interestingly, just to give a note of comfort, there was literally no gap at the moment between left-leaning and right-leaning audiences in their trust in national news organizations. So something we're doing in this country is right at the moment, but it needs to be cherished.
Exactly.
I've got to say, it's always nice as the chairman of a panel when somebody wraps up your panel for you better than you could have done yourself. So all I shall do is invite you to thank our panellists. Frankly, if the media bill was in their hands, I think we'd feel quite confident. Thank you very much.